Jake Murphy wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his cargo ship through the docking bay of Kepler Station. The old freighter groaned and shuddered as it settled onto the landing pad. He had been flying cargo runs for 15 years now, and his ship, the Iron Sparrow, was showing its age just like he was. The station buzzed with activity as always. Traders from dozens of worlds moved through the corridors carrying goods both legal and questionable. Kepler Station sat at the edge of human space where the laws were loose and credits talked louder than morals. Jake had seen plenty of things here that made his stomach turn, but he minded his own business and kept flying. He needed parts for his navigation system, and the station's mechanics charged triple what they would cost on Earth. That was the price of doing business this far from home. Jake counted his credits carefully before heading into the main market district. He had enough for the repairs, but not much else. The market sprawled across 3 levels of the station. The upper levels sold legitimate goods, while the lower you went, the more questionable things became. Jake found the parts he needed on level 2 and haggled with a Centauri merchant until they reached a fair price. As he walked back toward his ship, he heard shouting from the lower level. Curiosity got the better of him, and he descended the narrow stairs to level 3. The air here was thicker and smelled of exotic spices and unwashed bodies. Neon signs flickered in languages he could not read. Jake had never ventured this deep into the station's underbelly before. A crowd had gathered around a raised platform in the center of the market. Jake pushed through the mass of aliens and humans to see what was happening. His blood ran cold when he realized he was watching a slave auction. On the platform stood creatures from across the galaxy. Some were humanoid, while others had features that defied description. All of them wore energy shackles that glowed with malevolent light. Their eyes held the defeated look of beings who had given up hope. The auctioneer was a massive Vorthak with scarred hide and razor-sharp teeth. His voice boomed across the market as he described each slave's abilities and value. The Vorthak Empire was known throughout the galaxy for their cruelty and their love of enslaving other species. Jake felt sick watching the proceedings, but found himself unable to look away. The bidders called out prices in various currencies while the slaves stood motionless on the platform. Some of the buyers looked like legitimate traders, while others had the hard eyes of criminals and pirates. Then he saw her. The alien woman was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Her skin had a crystalline quality that seemed to catch and reflect light in impossible ways. Delicate patterns of luminescence traced across her features like living tattoos. She stood tall despite her shackles, and her eyes burned with defiance rather than defeat. The auctioneer's voice cut through Jake's thoughts. Next, we have a prime specimen from the Etherian homeworld. These psychic navigators can plot hyperspace jumps without computers, and their telepathic abilities make them valuable for many purposes. Jake had heard stories about the Etherians. They were a peaceful species known for their advanced mental abilities and their beautiful crystal cities. The Vorthak had conquered their world 6 months ago and enslaved the survivors. Most people in human space considered it a tragedy, but no one had been willing to intervene. The bidding started at 5,000 credits. Jake watched in horror. As the price climbed higher and higher, a hulking Drakmarian trader bid 8,000. A human in expensive clothes raised it to 10,000. The Etherian woman maintained her dignity throughout the process, but Jake could see the fear in her alien eyes. Something twisted in Jake's chest as he watched the auction continue. He thought about his own daughter back on Earth and how he would feel if she was standing on that platform. The woman might not be human, but she was clearly intelligent and aware of what was happening to her. The bidding reached 15,000 credits. Jake's hands trembled as he calculated his savings. He had exactly 16,000 credits to his name. It was everything he had earned over the past year of dangerous cargo runs. Without that money, he would be stranded on Kepler Station. With no way to repair his ship or buy fuel, the auctioneer called for final bids. The Drakmarian trader held at 15,000 and looked confident that he had won. Jake's heart pounded as he made a decision that would change his life forever. 16,000, Jake called out before he could stop himself. The crowd turned to stare at him. The human in expensive clothes looked surprised that a simple cargo pilot could afford such a bid. The Drakmarian trader snarled and muttered something in his native language. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with greed as he looked at Jake. 16,000 from the human pilot. Do I hear 17,000? The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Jake's palms were sweating and his mouth felt dry. He had just bid his entire life savings on a slave he did not even know. The rational part of his mind screamed that he was making a terrible mistake. Finally, the auctioneer brought down his hammer. Sold to the human for 16,000 credits. Jake's legs felt weak as he pushed through the crowd toward the payment. Station. The other bidders glared at him with a mixture of anger and respect. He had outbid some dangerous people and they would remember his face. But all he could think about was the relief he had seen flash across the Etherean woman's features when she realized she would not be going with the Drakmarian. The payment process was handled by a modified computer terminal that accepted credits from dozens of different banking systems. Jake's hands shook as he transferred his life savings to the auction house. The transaction was final and irreversible. He was now officially the owner of an Etherean slave. The thought made him sick, but he reminded himself that he had no intention of keeping her enslaved. Somehow he would find a way to free her and get her to safety. It was the right thing to do, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had worked for. A Vorthic guard led the woman over to Jake. Up close, she was even more beautiful and alien than he had imagined. Her crystalline skin seemed to pulse with inner light, and her eyes held an intelligence that was both familiar and utterly foreign. She studied Jake's face as if trying to understand what kind of person had just purchased her. Freedom. Jake looked into those alien eyes and made a silent promise. He would find a way to make this right, no matter what it cost him. The woman deserved freedom and dignity just like any other thinking being. It was time to prove that humanity could be better than the rest of the galaxy expected. Jake walked through the corridors of Kepler Station with the Etherean woman beside him. The Vorthic guard had removed her leg shackles but left the energy cuffs on her wrists. The glowing restraints hummed with power, and Jake could see they were causing her pain. Every few steps she would wince as the energy field pulsed against her crystalline skin. Other beings in the corridor stared at them as they passed. Some looked curious while others seemed hostile. Jake realized he was now marked as someone who did business with slavers. The thought made him uncomfortable, but he focused on getting the woman to his ship safely. The Iron Sparrow sat in docking bay 12, looking even more battered than usual. Jake had always been proud of his ship despite its age, but now he wondered what the alien woman thought of it. Her people had built crystal cities and traveled between stars before humans had invented the wheel. Jake activated the boarding ramp and gestured for her to follow him inside. She hesitated at the entrance and looked back at the station. For a moment he thought she might try to run, but then she stepped aboard his ship. The ramp closed behind them with a soft hiss. The cargo hold was cramped and filled with shipping containers. Jake led her through the narrow corridors to the small living area near the front of the ship. It was not much, but it had a table and 2 chairs along with a basic food preparation unit. The woman stood in the center of the room and looked around. With obvious confusion, Jake pointed to himself and said slowly, "Jake Murphy." Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. She stared at him for a long moment before speaking in a voice like wind chimes. "Zarathiel," she said, and touched her chest with her shackled hands. Jake nodded and smiled. "Zarathiel. That's a beautiful name." He knew she probably could not understand his words, but he hoped his tone would convey friendliness. The energy cuffs were still causing her pain, and Jake knew he had to remove them. He went to his toolkit and found a plasma cutter. The device was designed for ship repairs, but it should be able to cut through the restraints. He held it up and pointed to her shackles. Zarathiel backed away from him with fear in her eyes. She had probably seen too many beings hurt by their captors to trust anyone with a weapon. Jake set the cutter down on the table and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I want to help you," he said gently. "I want to free you." He made cutting motions with his hands and pointed to the shackles. Then he pointed to the door and made a walking gesture. Zarathiel seemed to understand that he wanted to remove her restraints so she could leave. She looked at him with something that might have been hope. Very slowly, Jake picked up the plasma cutter again. Zarathiel extended her arms and closed. Her eyes, her whole body was tense as if she expected to be hurt. Jake activated the cutter and carefully sliced through the energy cuffs. They fell to the floor with a clatter and immediately stopped glowing. Zarathiel rubbed her wrists where the cuffs had been. Her crystalline skin showed dark marks where the energy had burned her. Jake went to the medical kit and found some healing gel. He offered it to her and she took it hesitantly. As she treated her wounds, Jake prepared some food. He was not much of a cook, but he had protein bars and water. Zarathiel accepted the food gratefully and ate with delicate motions. She seemed surprised by the taste and looked at Jake with something like curiosity. Jake activated the ship's navigation system and brought up a star chart. He pointed to their current location at Kepler Station and then to the neutral zone where refugees from various conflicts could find safety. The distance was about 3 days at maximum speed. Zarathiel seemed to understand what he was showing her and nodded. The launch sequence took 10 minutes to complete. Jake felt the familiar vibration as the Iron Sparrow lifted off from the station and entered open space. Through the viewport he could see the stars stretching into lines as they jumped to hyperspace. Zarathiel watched the display with wonder, as if she had never seen space travel from this perspective. For the first day they traveled in relative silence. Jake tried to make conversation, but the language barrier was too great. Zarathiel seemed more relaxed now that she was free, but she still watched him carefully. He supposed she had good reason to be cautious after what she had been through. On the second day, Zarathiel began to speak. She would point to objects around the ship and say their names in her language. Jake would repeat the words back to her and then tell her the human names. Slowly, they began to build a basic vocabulary they could share. Jake learned that Zarathiel came from a world called Etheria, where her people lived in harmony with crystal formations that grew from the ground. The Vorthak had destroyed the crystals and enslaved anyone who survived. She had been separated from her family and did not know if they were alive or dead. The sadness in her voice when she spoke of her lost world made Jake's heart ache. He tried to tell her about Earth and human civilization, but found it hard to explain things like war and poverty to someone whose people had lived in peace for centuries. Humanity seemed crude and violent compared to the Etherians. On the third day, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Jake rushed to the control panel and saw 3 Vorthak interceptors approaching fast. They must have tracked the Iron Sparrow from Kepler Station. The military ships were much faster and better armed than his old cargo hauler. "Attention, human vessel," came a harsh voice over the communication system. "You are in possession of stolen Vorthak property. Surrender immediately or be destroyed." Jake looked at Zarathiel and saw terror in her eyes. She understood enough about the situation to know what would happen if they were caught. The Vorthak did not show mercy to escaped slaves or those who helped them. "I'm not giving you back to them," Jake said firmly. "I promise." The Vorthak ships were closing fast, and Jake knew he had only minutes before they would be in weapons range. His cargo ship was no match for military vessels, but he had one advantage. He knew these shipping lanes better than anyone in there. Was an asteroid field nearby that might provide cover. Jake pushed the engines to maximum power and changed course toward the asteroids. The Iron Sparrow shuddered under the strain but held together. Behind them, the Vorthak ships adjusted their pursuit and began firing warning shots. The asteroid field was a maze of floating rocks and debris from an ancient collision. Jake had navigated through it before during his cargo runs, but never at this speed. One wrong move would mean death for both him and Zara Thiel. The first Vorthak ship followed them into the field and immediately struck a large asteroid. The explosion lit up space and sent debris flying in all directions. The other 2 ships slowed down and tried to find a safer path through the rocks. Jake used his knowledge of the field to stay ahead of his pursuers. He guided the Iron Sparrow through narrow passages and around massive boulders. The ship's hull scraped against several rocks and warning lights flashed on the control panel. Finally, they emerged from the other side of the asteroid field. The Vortex ships were nowhere to be seen, and Jake allowed himself to hope they had escaped. But the damage to his ship was severe, and he doubted the Iron Sparrow would survive another chase. Zarathiel placed her hand on his shoulder and spoke in her musical voice. Jake did not understand the words, but he could hear the gratitude in her tone. She knew he had risked everything to keep her free and that knowledge made all the danger worthwhile. The Iron Sparrow limped toward New Geneva Station with smoke trailing from its damaged engines. Jake watched the warning lights flash on his control panel and prayed the ship would hold together long enough to reach the docking bay. The escape through the asteroid field had saved their lives but nearly destroyed his vessel. New Geneva Station was different from Kepler Station in every way that mattered. Where Kepler was a den of criminals and smugglers, New Geneva was a sanctuary for refugees from across the galaxy. The station's governing council had declared it neutral territory, where all beings could find safety regardless of their species or past. As they approached the docking bay, Jake could see ships from dozens of different worlds. Sleek Centauri cruisers sat beside battered human freighters. Exotic vessels from the outer rim glowed with strange energies. It was a place where the galaxies displaced and forgotten could start over. The docking controller's voice crackled over the communication system. Iron Sparrow, you are cleared for emergency landing in Bay 7. Medical and repair crews are standing by. Jake brought his ship down with more force than he intended. The landing gear groaned under the impact and several systems failed completely. But they were alive and safe, and that was what mattered most. He looked at Zarathiel and saw relief in her alien features. The repair crew chief was a gruff human named Pete who had been working on ships longer than Jake had been alive. He walked around the Iron Sparrow, shaking his head and making notes on a data pad. The damage was extensive and would take weeks to repair. How much is this going to cost me? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. More than you have, Pete replied honestly. The engine core is cracked and the navigation system is fried. You're looking at 30,000 credits minimum. Jake felt his heart sink. He had spent his life savings to buy Zarathiel's freedom, and now had less than 1,000 credits left. There was no way he could afford to repair his ship. Without the Iron Sparrow, he had no way to earn money and no way to leave the station. Zarathiel seemed to understand his distress even though she could not follow the conversation. She had been learning human words quickly and could pick up emotions from facial expressions and tone of voice. She placed her hand on his arm in a gesture of comfort. A group of Etherians approached them as they stood in the docking bay. There were 5 of them, and they moved with the same graceful dignity that Zarathiel possessed. Their crystalline skin glowed softly in the station's artificial light, and their eyes held ancient wisdom. The eldest of the group stepped forward and spoke to Zarathiel in their musical language. She replied quickly, and Jake caught his name mentioned several times. The other Etherians looked at him with expressions of surprise and gratitude. They want to thank you, Zarathiel said in carefully pronounced English. They say you are the first human to show kindness to our people since the Vorthok came. Jake felt embarrassed by their attention. I just did what anyone would do, he said. Zarathiel translated his words, and the Etherians made soft sounds that might have been laughter. The eldest spoke again, and Zarathiel nodded seriously. He says that is not true. Most beings in the galaxy care only for themselves. You sacrificed everything to help a stranger. This is rare and precious. The Etherians had found passage on a refugee transport that would take them to a hidden colony world where survivors of their people were trying to rebuild. They invited Zarathiel to join them, and she accepted gratefully. Jake was happy for her, but also sad to see her go. They had only known each other for a few days, but he had grown fond of her company. She was intelligent and kind and had shown him that there were wonders in the galaxy beyond his imagination. Her people's way of thinking was so different from human culture that every conversation was a learning experience. The transport ship would leave in 2 hours, and Zarathiel needed to prepare for the journey. Jake helped her gather the few possessions he had given her during their time together. She seemed reluctant to leave and kept looking back at him as if memorizing his face. As they stood in the docking bay waiting for the transport to board, Zarathiel turned to Jake with tears in her alien eyes. She had been practicing English words and now she spoke them carefully. "Jake Murphy," she said, "you gave me freedom. You gave me life I will never forget." She reached up and placed her hands on either side of his face. Her crystalline skin felt warm against his cheeks and began to glow with soft light. Jake felt a strange tingling sensation as if electricity was flowing through his body. Suddenly he was no longer standing in the docking bay. He was floating in a vast space filled with stars and nebulae. Around him swirled images and emotions that did not belong to him. He saw Zarathiel's homeworld before the Vorthak came. Crystal towers reaching toward purple skies. Gardens where her people tended to growing light itself. Then came the darkness. Vorthak ships descending from space like metal insects. The crystal cities cracking and falling. Her family scattered to the winds. Months of slavery and despair. The gradual loss of hope as she was sold from one master to another, and then light returned. Jake saw himself through her eyes at the slave auction. A simple human with kind eyes who was willing to sacrifice everything for a stranger. She had felt his emotions in that moment and knew that he acted from pure compassion with no thought of reward. The vision faded, and Jake found himself back in the docking bay. Zarathiel removed her hands from his face and stepped back. The glow in her skin slowly dimmed, but her eyes remained bright with emotion. "What was that?" Jake asked in wonder. "A memory bond," she replied. "So you will know that your kindness mattered. So you will know that you changed everything." The transport ship's boarding call echoed through the station. Zarathiel picked up her small bag and walked toward the airlock. At the entrance, she turned back one last time. "Goodbye, Jake Murphy," she said. "I hope we meet again." Jake watched until the airlock closed and the transport ship departed. He stood in the docking bay for a long time thinking about the vision she had shared with him. He had seen the best and worst of the galaxy through her eyes and understood that his simple act of kindness had meant more than he could have imagined. The station administrator, Carlos Rivera, found him there an hour later. Rivera was a weathered man who had seen his share of tragedy and triumph. He had been watching Jake since the Iron Sparrow arrived and was impressed by what he had witnessed. "I heard what you did," Rivera said. "That took courage." Jake shrugged. "It was the right thing to do," maybe Rivera replied. "But not everyone would have done it. We could use someone like you here on the station. The repair crews always need good mechanics and the pay is decent." Jake looked around the docking bay at the ships from 100 different worlds. He thought about Zarathiel traveling to her new home among the stars. His old life was over, but perhaps a new one was beginning. "I accept," he said. Rivera smiled and shook his hand. "Welcome to New Geneva Station, Jake Murphy. Something tells me you're going to fit right in." As Jake walked toward his new life, he felt the memory bond warm against his thoughts. Somewhere among the stars, Zarathiel was safe and free. That knowledge made everything else bearable. He had lost his ship and his savings, but gained something far more valuable. He had learned that doing the right thing always mattered, even when it cost everything. 3 months had passed since Zarathiel left New Geneva Station and Jake had settled into his new life as a mechanic. His small workshop in the lower levels of the station had become a gathering place for refugees from across the galaxy. Beings who had lost everything found comfort in his simple kindness and practical help. Jake had always been good with his hands, but working on alien technology had expanded his skills in ways he never imagined. Each species built their ships differently, and he had learned to adapt human tools to fix Centauri energy systems and Drachmarian pulse engines. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways that simple cargo runs had never been. The refugee community on New Geneva Station was unlike anything Jake had experienced. Humans worked alongside beings whose ancestors had been enemies for generations. Former soldiers shared meals with the families of their victims. The station's neutral status created a unique environment, where old hatreds could be set aside in favor of survival and hope. Carlos Rivera had become a good friend and mentor. The station administrator had been through his own share of hardships and understood the value of second chances. He often stopped by Jake's workshop to check on his progress and share stories of his early days on the station. "You're becoming quite the celebrity," Rivera said one evening as Jake finished repairing a Rigelian trader's navigation computer. "Word is getting around about the human who bought a slave just to set her free." Jake felt uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what felt right," he said while cleaning grease from his hands. "That's exactly why people respect you," Rivera replied. "In a galaxy full of beings who take advantage of others, you chose to sacrifice everything for a stranger. That means something." The workshop door chimed, and Jake looked up to see a young Etherian male enter. The being's crystalline skin was dim with exhaustion, and his clothes were torn and dirty. Jake recognized the signs of someone who had been traveling hard for days. "You are Jake Murphy," the Etherian said in heavily accented English. "I bring word from Zarathiel." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had thought about her often over the past 3 months, but had no way to contact her. The refugee networks were deliberately secretive to protect their people from bounty hunters and slavers. "Is she safe?" Jake asked immediately. The young Etherian nodded. "She is more than safe. She has become a voice of the High Council. The elders were impressed by her story of human kindness and chose her to speak for our people." Jake felt a surge of pride for his friend. He had seen her intelligence and strength during their brief time together and was glad she had found a place where her abilities were valued. "She asked me to tell you that she has not forgotten her promise," the Etherian continued. "She said you would understand." Jake remembered the memory bond they had shared before she left. In that moment of connection, he had felt her gratitude and her determination to somehow repay his kindness. But he had assumed it was just emotional words spoken in the heat of the moment. The Etherian handed Jake a small crystal that pulsed with internal light. "She will return in 7 days. Be ready." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the young being turned and left the workshop. Jake stared at the crystal in his palm and wondered what Zarathiel was planning. The memory bond still warmed his thoughts sometimes, and he hoped she was happy in her new life. 7 days passed slowly. Jake found himself distracted from his work and constantly checking the docking bay schedules. Rivera noticed his nervous energy and asked several times if everything was all right. Jake did not know how to explain his situation without sounding crazy. On the 7th day, Jake was working late in his workshop when the station's communication system crackled to life. "All residents, please note that we have an unscheduled arrival in Docking Bay 1. Please remain calm and allow security to handle the situation." Jake dropped his tools and ran toward the docking bay. He pushed through crowds of curious onlookers and station security officers. At the center of the commotion sat a ship unlike anything he had ever seen. The vessel was organic in appearance with flowing curves that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Its hull was made of some kind of living crystal that pulsed with soft colors. Strange symbols glowed along its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The airlock opened with a sound like wind chimes, and Zarathiel emerged. But she was transformed from the frightened slave he had rescued months ago. Her crystalline skin now glowed with inner light, and she wore robes that seemed to be made of solidified starlight. Behind her came other Etherians in similar attire. The crowd fell silent as she walked across the docking bay. Her presence commanded respect, and even the hardened security officers stepped aside. She moved with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the universe. Jake pushed through the crowd, and their eyes met across the busy docking bay. Zarathiel smiled and walked directly toward him. The other Etherians followed at a respectful distance. "Hello, Jake Murphy," she said in perfect English. "I told you I would not forget." "Zarathiel," Jake replied. "You look incredible. I heard you joined the High Council." "I did more than join them," she said with obvious pride. "I convinced them that humanity deserves a chance. Your kindness opened their minds to possibilities they had never considered." She gestured to the other Etherians who had accompanied her. "These are keepers of the sacred knowledge. They guard our people's most precious secrets. I have brought them here to meet the human who changed everything. Jake felt overwhelmed by the formal attention. I'm just a mechanic now, he said. I don't know what you think I can do. You can accept a gift, Zerathil replied. My people have decided that humanity is ready for something that has never been shared with another species. We offer you knowledge and partnership. One of the keepers stepped forward carrying a container that seemed to be made of crystallized light. Inside, Jake could see something that pulsed with the same energy as Zerathil's skin. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. This is a memory crystal, Zerathil explained. It contains the collective knowledge of our people. Science, philosophy, art, and wisdom gathered over thousands of years. It is our most sacred treasure. Jake stared at the crystal in amazement. I can't accept something like that. It's too valuable. You saved my life, Zerathil said simply. More than that, you showed me that there are beings in the galaxy who act from pure compassion. The High Council studied your actions and concluded that humanity has a rare quality. You help others even when it costs you everything. She reached out and touched his hand. This crystal will allow your people to learn from ours. But more importantly, it will create a bond between our species. We offer humanity friendship and alliance. Jake looked around the docking bay at the crowd of refugees and station workers. Beings from dozens of worlds watched the ceremony with wonder and hope. He realized that this moment would be remembered long after he was gone. I accept, he said quietly. On behalf of humanity, I accept your gift. Zerathil smiled, and the crystal container was placed in his hands. The moment his fingers touched the surface, Jake felt a surge of knowledge and emotion. Visions of Etherean history flashed through his mind. He saw their first contact with the stars and their development of technologies that seemed like magic, but most of all he felt their hope. They had chosen to trust humanity based on the actions of one simple cargo pilot. The responsibility was enormous, but Jake knew he would not face it alone. Thank you, he whispered. No, Jake Murphy, Zerathil replied. Thank you for showing us that kindness still exists in the galaxy. Thank you for proving that doing the right thing always matters. The crowd began to cheer, and Jake realized that his life had changed once again. He was no longer just a mechanic or a cargo pilot. He had become a bridge between two species and a symbol of humanity's potential for good. The memory crystal sat on Jake's workbench, glowing softly in the dim light of his workshop. 3 days had passed since Zerathil had presented him with the sacred artifact, and he was still trying to understand what it meant. The crystal was beautiful, but also overwhelming. He could feel knowledge pressing against his mind whenever he touched it. Carlos Rivera had been in constant communication with Earth authorities since the ceremony. News of the Etherean gift had spread quickly through human space, and everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Scientists and diplomats were already traveling to New Geneva Station to study the crystal and meet with the Etherean delegation. Jake felt out of his depth with all the attention. Military officers and government officials kept asking him questions about alien technology and interstellar politics. He was just a mechanic who had tried to do the right thing. The idea that his simple act of kindness had led to this moment seemed impossible. Zerathil had remained on the station with her delegation, while they waited for the human authorities to arrive. She spent most of her time in meetings with Rivera and the station council, but she visited Jake's workshop every evening. Their conversations had become easier as her English improved, and his understanding of Etherean culture grew. You seem troubled, she said as she entered the workshop on the 4th evening. Her crystalline skin reflected the light from the memory crystal and created dancing patterns on the walls. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, Jake admitted. Everyone expects me to be some kind of expert on alien relations, but I'm nobody special. Zerathil laughed with a sound like silver bells. That is exactly why you are the right person. The crystal chose you because you are genuine. You act from your heart without thinking about personal gain. She moved closer to the workbench and placed her hand near the crystal. The artifact responded to her presence by glowing brighter and pulsing in rhythm with her breathing. May I show you how to use it properly? she asked. Jake nodded and watched as she picked up the crystal with both hands. Her skin began to glow, in harmony with the artifact, and her eyes took on a distant look. The memory crystal contains more than just information, she explained. It holds the experiences and emotions of my people. To truly understand it, you must open your mind completely. She held the crystal out to Jake, and he took it carefully. The moment his fingers made contact, he felt a rush of sensation that was almost too much to bear. Images flooded his mind, showing him the history of the Etherian people from their earliest days to the present. He saw their homeworld, as it had been before the Vorthek invasion. Crystal cities that grew from the ground, like living things. Gardens where light itself was cultivated as if it were a flower. Art and music that existed as pure thought, shared between minds, but he also experienced their knowledge of science and technology. The crystal showed him how to manipulate matter at the molecular level and bend space to travel between stars. He learned about energy sources that could power entire worlds and medical techniques that could extend life for centuries. Most importantly, he felt their philosophy and way of thinking. The Etherians viewed the universe as a living entity where all things were connected. They believed that kindness and compassion were the fundamental forces that held reality together. Violence and hatred were seen as diseases that needed to be healed. When the visions ended, Jake found himself sitting on the floor of his workshop with tears streaming down his face. The knowledge in the crystal was vast beyond imagination, but it was the emotional content that had affected him most deeply. He had experienced the love that the Etherian people felt for all living things. Now you understand, Zarathiel said gently. This is why we chose to trust humanity. Your species has the same capacity for love and sacrifice that we value above all else. Over the following weeks, Jake worked with human scientists and Etherian teachers to unlock the secrets of the memory crystal. The knowledge it contained was revolutionary and would change human civilization forever. Medical breakthroughs that could cure diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. Energy technology that would make war over resources unnecessary. Space travel methods that would open the entire galaxy to exploration. But the most important changes were not technological. The crystal's philosophy began to influence human thinking in ways that surprised everyone. People who experienced even small portions of its knowledge came away changed. They became more compassionate and more willing to work together for the common good. Jake found himself at the center of a transformation that was spreading across human space. He had been appointed as the official liaison between humanity and the Etherian High Council. It was a role he had never wanted, but he had come to understand its importance. The partnership between the two species grew stronger with each passing month. Human colonies began implementing Etherian agricultural techniques that could feed millions. Etherian refugees found new homes on human worlds where they were welcomed as teachers and friends. The galaxy started to see humanity in a new light. As a species capable of growth and wisdom, Jake often thought about the moment at the slave auction when he had decided to bid his life savings for Zarathiel's freedom. At the time, it had seemed like a simple choice between right and wrong. He could never have imagined that it would lead to the transformation of two civilizations. A year after receiving the memory crystal, Jake stood on the observation deck of Unity Station. The new facility had been built jointly by humans and Etherians, as a symbol of their alliance. Through the massive viewports, he could see ships from both species, working together to explore the unknown regions of space. Zara Thiel joined him at the observation window. She had become his closest friend and advisor as they worked to strengthen the bond between their peoples. Her presence still filled him with wonder, but he had grown comfortable with the strangeness of their friendship. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "giving up your old life for a stranger?" Jake smiled and shook his head. "How could I regret something that led to all this? Besides, I gained far more than I lost." "My people have a saying," Zarathiel said. "A single act of kindness can change the course of the stars." You proved that saying true. They stood in comfortable silence watching the ships move through space. Representatives from dozens of species had come to Unity Station to learn about the Human-Etherian Alliance. The galaxy was beginning to understand that cooperation was more powerful than conquest. Jake thought about all the beings who would benefit from the partnership between their species. Children who would grow up in a galaxy where different peoples work together instead of fighting. Scientists who would unlock mysteries that no single species could solve alone. Artists who would create beauty that combined the best of many cultures. "What happens next?" Jake asked. Zarathel smiled, and her crystalline skin glowed with warm light. "We continue to grow. We explore the galaxy together and help other species find their own paths to wisdom. We prove that the universe is large, enough for everyone to flourish." A human supply ship approached the station carrying new colonists who would help expand the joint settlements. Jake watched it dock and thought about the families aboard who were starting new lives among the stars. They were part of a future that would be brighter than anything he could have imagined. The simple cargo pilot who had once struggled to make ends meet was gone. In his place stood a man who had helped forge an alliance that would last for generations. Jake Murphy had learned that sometimes the smallest actions could have the greatest consequences. All it took was the courage to do what was right when it mattered most.